Hello, my name is Richard Austin. I'd like to welcome you to my session, which is entitled Sanitization or Anti-Forensics, IEEE 2883, and Digital Forensics. We're going to pause here for a few seconds so you can read over the SNIA legal notice, which governs the content of this presentation, and then we'll get started. Okay, based on the abstract, which hopefully you looked at on the web, I've structured this presentation into two sections. The first is going to cover sanitization as the normal part of the data lifecycle with the intent of assuring that no unauthorized disclosure of information occurs when storage is repurposed or discarded. In the second half, we're going to talk about the potential impacts of sanitization on the practice of digital forensics. So what is sanitization and what does IEEE 2883 have to say about it? It all starts out with the fact that we have a problem. Our society generates and stores data at a prodigious rate. Think back to the first personal computer you ever purchased and how large the storage device on that was. And now think about the fact that it's nothing unusual for us to go out to a local computer store and buy a 1 terabyte solid state drive. So the devices keep getting bigger and we keep finding more and more information to store on them. However, these storage devices are repurposed, sold on the used market, eventually fail, or become technologically obsolete. So how do we make sure that the data on those devices is no longer accessible? So that's sanitization, which is the process we go through when we repurpose or discard storage to make sure its previous contents are removed. The idea here is to prevent unauthorized disclosure of information. Formally, sanitize is defined as render access to target data infeasible for a given level of effort. And sanitization is such an important process that the IEEE Computer Society Security and Storage Working Group, or CISSP-Retired, developed a standard, IEEE 2883, to guide organizations in effectively sanitizing storage. I'm going to cover 2883 at a relatively high level. If you want the details, please do check out the session by Jim Hatfield, who's the chair of the Security and Storage Working Group. So what is level of effort? It basically represents how hard an adversary will work to recover the data. Here's a little equation for it, which basically says the level of effort an adversary will apply depends on the value of the data to the adversary and the capability of the adversary. Some examples of adversaries and their capabilities are a curious employee with a simple file and delete utility, a competitor with access to the commercial forensics tools, and these aren't restricted, anybody can buy them that has the budget, a technically sophisticated adversary with access to tools commonly found in a well-equipped university research lab or forensic lab, and a well-funded nation-state intelligence service performing economic espionage on behalf of their government is basically going to have access to most anything. Obviously, it's much easier to foil the curious employee than a nation-state intelligence service, and that's why there are 3 different sanitization methods. The first is clear, which is sanitize using logical techniques on user data and all user addressable storage locations for protection against simple, non-invasive data recovery techniques using the same host interface available to the user. Non-invasive means you don't get to disassemble the device to get access to things that aren't exposed through the host interface. Purge is sanitize using logical or physical techniques that make recovery of the target data infeasible using state-of-the-art laboratory techniques, but it preserves the storage media and device in a potentially reusable state. We say potentially reusable because there may be things you need to do to put it back before you put it back in a service, think format, build a file system, whatever. Destruct is sanitized using physical techniques that make recovery of target data infeasible using state-of-the-art laboratory techniques, but results in the subsequent inability to use the storage device. When you destruct a device, its toast no longer can be used to store data. Obviously, clear offers the least resistance, while purge and destruct offer more. So what are state-of-the-art laboratory techniques? It's a difficult thing to define because they're open-ended. Basically, it's anything an adversary can come up with to access data on storage. And keep in mind, it's not restricted to the normal mode of access through the host interface. It may include disassembling the device to access internal components. It may include replacing the device firmware or building a custom storage controller, or most anything else. It's the type of thing a group of PhDs and talented engineers might develop when given a healthy budget and lots of equipment. So in detail, clear is the simplest of the sanitization method. It's basically just write zeros or any other value to all user addressable locations on the device. Notice it only affects user addressable portions of the device. It doesn't affect over-provisioned space, spared blocks, host protected areas, device configuration overlays, etc. And what this means is that even if you write zeros to every block that is addressable through the host interface, there may be data left in these other areas that wasn't touched, and a sufficiently adept adversary might be able to retrieve them. Writing to every addressable location to clear a device does create wear on solid-state devices. So beware of doing multiple overwrite passes. A single pass of zeros is usually sufficient for most any purpose. Depending on the drive technology, there are alternatives to overwrite for accomplishing a clear that do not cause wear on the device. So check out 2883 for the details on that. Purge. Purge methods affect both the user addressable and non-user addressable portions of the device. Purge, of course, makes recovery of data infeasible even when using state-of-the-art laboratory techniques. And they do leave the devices in a potentially reusable state. An example of a purge technique is cryptographic erase, where all the data on the drive is encrypted and the sanitization process is to delete all copies of the encryption keys. This places the adversary in a position of having to write or mount a cryptanalytic attack against the encrypted data, which with modern well-vetted crypto systems and good implementations of crypto system is a very, 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 very difficult thing to do. Destruct methods use physical techniques that make recovery of the data infeasible using state-of-the-art laboratory techniques, but render the device unusable. An example would be physically shredding the device. Keep in mind that destruct might be the only option in case of failed devices, but more environmentally friendly methods should be used whenever possible. In other words, whenever they're permitted by the risk tolerance of your organization. Choosing a sanitization method. There's no way I or anyone else sitting up on the high chair can tell you that you should use this sanitization method and it's going to be perfect for you, because it's a risk-based decision. In other words, it's going to depend on the value of the information, the threat environment the organization faces. In other words, what are its adversaries and what are their capabilities, the regulatory environment of the organization. And this gets into what legal ramifications a unauthorized disclosure of information might have, and the risk tolerance of the organization. Typically, mature, well-regulated organizations, think banks, financial institutions, are most risk adverse, while new startups that are investing lots of money trying to come up with the next big thing are more risk tolerant. And the process for choosing a sanitization method will usually be formalized in a security policy. So check it out with your security people. So is 2883 the end of forensics as we know it? Well, first, probably need to start with what is digital forensics? Well, the word itself comes from the Latin forensis, meaning having to do with courts or public discussion. And basically, it's the process for identifying, acquiring, preserving, and analyzing data of potential evidentiary value. And one important source of such things is data on storage. What does a digital investigation look like? Well, basically, you have an investigation, which means there's some question that we're not sure of the answer to, and we need to collect information to resolve it. So the first thing the investigators do when they get on site is they go through an identification process where they basically look in the environment and see what all sources of relevant information there are that are available. And then there's kind of a fork, depending on whether you're in law enforcement or the private sector, In law enforcement, you're going to do a collection, which basically means you seize all of those sources and you're going to take them away. Whereas in the private sector, you're going to acquire it, which simply means you make an image of them for later analysis. And then you preserve that evidence, which basically means you protect it from being damaged or modified, and then eventually goes into the analysis process. And reviewing again, the intent of 2883 is basically to guide organizations in effectively sanitizing their storage. It provides extensive guidance on the sanitization methods available in the newer storage devices and maps them to the 3 sanitization methods. This is fantastically useful. Prior to 2883, that information was scattered across multiple hardware standards that were not necessarily the easiest to get a hold of or the least expensive to get a hold of. So basically, the CISSP was very fortunate in having subject matter experts in those standards that were able to pull that information out and classify it under the 3 sanitization methods to make it very useful for us as the storage consumers. But organizations must implement the guidance in 2883 to effectively sanitize their storage. There's a cautionary tale here. Back in 2006, NIST published special publication 800-88 media sanitization. So one would expect here 16 years later that most entities, whether they're individuals or organizations, would be using basics sanitization hygiene before selling used equipment to the public. Unfortunately, continuing studies show that devices are routinely offered for sale with their contents either intact or easily retrievable. So forensic community should continue to be aware that entities' implementation of 2883 may be neither complete nor error-free. It's also dependent on implementations of standards. Devices don't execute standards, they execute implementations of standards. And as we've seen before, these implementations are not necessarily complete or error-free. So one would expect the forensics community to assess the implementation of these commands across manufacturers to determine their adequacy and accuracy of implementation and how effective they actually are. Threat models. Developers of standards, either consciously or unconsciously, use a threat model, which represents adversary capabilities and therefore what they're going to have to counter. And sometimes that threat model may not be truly representative of reality. For example, a sanitize command might mark all data blocks as invalid, meaning they cannot be read until they're rewritten. Sounds pretty good, pretty secure. However, it's effective against attempts to read those blocks through the host interface. However, a well-funded capable adversary might develop a custom storage controller or custom firmware that would ignore those invalid markings and read the data blocks anyway. A custom storage controller is an example, or firmware is an example of a state-of-the-art laboratory technique, and that possibility was obviously not part of the threat model. Use of a storage controller or custom firmware is described in this paper available at this link, published back in 2011. So this is definitely not science fiction. And more information about such exploits can be found in Ross Anderson's book, Security Engineering, now in its 3rd edition. So forensic practitioners should evaluate the threat model used by standard developers to determine whether the developer has underestimated their capabilities. And not just DIST. There are many other sources of useful information that are available in most environments. There's memory traffic flow, or network traffic flows, or the traffic itself, various types of logs, and any other sources of relevant information in an infrastructure. And most of these sources are outside the purview of 2883. So, not the end. While it's true that a well-implemented sanitization program based on IEEE 2883 should result in less data available to be recovered on sanitized media, I still expect digital forensics to continue to be useful for a very long time to come. Most people that implement 2883 will be organizations seeking to reuse storage media internally or sell them on the used market, with the intent of avoiding unauthorized disclosure of information. Entities that want to use the guidance in 2883 to conceal evidence of wrongdoing or culpability are going to face some challenges, such as the fact that the guidance is not necessarily trivial to implement. For example, issuing some of the sanitization commands may require booting up under a different operating system, which does take some time. So for example, if it's a Windows host, issue the commands, you may have to boot up under a Linux thumb drive. So to answer the question posed back at the beginning of the presentation, is it sanitization or anti-forensics? Forensics is all about retrieving all the relevant information remaining on a device, while sanitization is all about removing all information from a device. So obviously, yes, there is definitely a tension between the two. The answer depends on intent. Why are you using the sanitization? It's a legitimate process used to prepare media for reuse or discard, while anti-forensics connotes an attempt to conceal evidence of wrongdoing or culpability. So the answer to it is going to depend on the intent on why you're doing the sanitization process. Thank you so much for attending. Hopefully the presentation was useful to you. And if you do need to get in touch with me, the best way is via email at raustin@ieee.org.